My name is Dr. Katie Morass, and I'm a senior lecturer in psychology and deputy director for the Centre for Applied Autism Research at the University of Bath. This presentation I'm going to give is about obtaining testimony from autistic individuals. So in this talk, I'll start with an overview of how differences in autistic cognition mean that traditional police interviewing models, which were developed for neurotypical individuals, are often inappropriate for autistic interviewees. Next, I'll outline attempts to adapt interviewing techniques with varying success for autistic witnesses. And then in the last part of my talk, I'll briefly consider some remaining challenges. So first of all, let's look at how my autism impacts upon a person's ability to provide evidence. So when we think about police interviews, they're formal social interactions which present numerous challenges for autistic people unless modifications that are made for a more enabling environment. So some of the difficulties that autistic people experience that are particularly relevant in a police interview are difficulties with language and communication. So this can involve a very literal interpretation of questions. So for example, questions like, I'm going to jog your memory, or draw your own conclusions, or questions that are posed as statements like Ben told you he was home all evening might not be answered in the way that the questioner intends them to be answered because they're taken very literally. And in autism as well, we quite often see a kind of mismatch between receptive and expressive language abilities. So expressive language, so spoken language, can actually be very good, at least in individuals without accompanying intellectual disability. But that can be quite misleading and masking an underlying difficulty in what we call receptive language ability. So this is ability to understand what is being said to a person. Difficulties in social cognition as well can also make police interviews quite difficult. So we're thinking about when you're an interviewee in an interview, you're thinking about what the interviewer knows already, what they might want to know, how much to tell, when to stop. All of this is what we call social cognition or mind reading. And this is another area of difficulty for an autistic person. Executive function. So this is holding lots of information and manipulating it temporarily kind of online in one's head. This can be present difficulties for remembering, for example, all parts of a very long-winded question, or trying to figure out what an interviewer wants to know whilst trying to recall a memory. We've also got episodic memory difficulties in autism. So it's not correct to say that autistic people have difficulties with memory more broadly, but they have quite specific difficulties with episodic memory, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. Autistic people also have difficulties with narratives and processing the relations among elements of an experience. So generating a kind of coherent narrative that attends to all the different components of a story or an event, taking into account the listener's needs and sort of drawing the connected dots between all the different characters and the plot points can be quite difficult. Autistic people also have difficulty with metacognitive monitoring. So when you're recalling information in a police interview, you're consistently monitoring how much you know, how accurate you think you are for each detail type. And then you make a series of decisions unconsciously about whether to report each detail, depending on how confident you are that that detail is going to be correct. And this is quite a complex process and can be, as I said, quite difficult for an autistic person. And then, of course, police interview situation or any kind of legal interview is likely to be a completely new environment, quite high stress. There might be some sensory issues going on. So, for example, in a police station, there might be strip lighting. There might be lots of noises. It might be quite strong smells coming from other cells and so forth. This can be quite anxiety provoking for anybody, but particularly an autistic person who may be more likely to have sensory difficulties. So this is likely to lead to quite significant stress, particularly for an autistic person. So we need to make the environment more enabling to overcome these difficulties so that they're able to provide their best evidence. So just a bit more about memory. So episodic memory is a specific type of memory, and it's in contrast to what we call semantic memory. So semantic memory is remembering information, either general facts or facts about one's own lifetime, whereas episodic memory is remembering specific episodes. And autistic people have perfectly good semantic memory, but it's the episodic memory that can be they can find difficult recalling. So episodes of an experience are kind of bound in contextual information. So, for example, the last time you went out for dinner, you'll be remembering who you were with, where you went, what you ate, and then other contextual information that makes that episode distinct from all the other times you've been out for dinner. So autistic people tend to remember more general and factual information. So, for example, they might know information about where a particular restaurant is, or they might know that their friend has a new job, which they told them about during that last time they went out for dinner with them. But they find it difficult to recall all of these elements of experience together to sort of pinpoint it as one specific episode. And as such, they can have difficulties monitoring the source of information, so remembering where or when they learned something. So it's very much this specific episodic memory that is problematic in autism. Importantly, autistic people can recall as much episodic information as non-autistic people if they are appropriately prompted. So the task support hypothesis developed by Dermot Bowler and colleagues posits that with more support at test, autistic people can recall just as much, or their episodic memory difficulties are basically eliminated largely. So whereas on free recall, they tend to show less complete and sometimes less accurate recall. When you start giving them more cues, so narrowing the question parameters. So, for example, if they've learned a list of words and you prompt them with, tell me the items of furniture that were on that list of words, or tell me items of fruit, they start recalling more information. And then if you give them recognition tests, then it's largely their recall is undistinguishable from non-autistic people. So this is really important because it suggests that any episodic memory difficulties may be more related to retrieval rather than encoding. So the memory is there, but it's the way that we elicit the memory that is the problem, which is encouraging because it suggests that we can develop techniques that can elicit more detailed and accurate memories from autistic people. So how effective are current police interviewing methods for an autistic person? I'll just say at this point that all the evidence to date is from witnesses, so we can only really make inferences for suspects, but the general principles should be there, although we would expect, as I'll touch upon at the end of this presentation, that some of the pressures will be stronger for suspects. We're also lacking a kind of robust empirical or experimental evidence base on courtroom questioning. So most of this work that I'm going to present relates to more lab-based findings and experimental setups that are designed to test police interviewing techniques for witnesses. So the standard structure for witness interviewing is to start with free recall and then ask questions based on what the witness has already said. And this is the kind of gold standard of police interviewing. So this is important to avoid leading a witness, to avoid constraining recall. So it's very much emphasised to officers that they should use very open questions, they shouldn't interrupt witnesses, they should encourage them to engage in an exhaustive search in order to induce more elaborative responses. And this is based on a lot of evidence that we have that free recall is less contaminated. It tends to be more accurate and you can get more investigatively relevant information without contaminating it. And then you can follow up with questioning and narrow it down based on what a witness has already said. However, the free recall is problematic in autism, as I've already said, and mentioned the task support hypothesis there. And we find that studies that have looked at this specifically in relation to eyewitness testimony find that autistic people's or witnesses' recall is often less complete, can be less accurate. It can be less specific, so less pinpointing to a particular episode and providing more general information. And it can also be sometimes less relevant. So it can sometimes be lacking in coherence and causality, which relates to these difficulties in narrative, producing narratives. So the cognitive interview is one of the most widely researched and used evidence-based police interviewing techniques. It was developed by two American psychologists in the early 1990s based on solid memory principles. The first being that if you match the contextual environment when it comes to retrieving an event, that you experienced when you encoded it, you can recall more details. So this is what we call context reinstatement, and it involves listening to the interviewer, the witness closing their eyes, listening to the interviewer to travel back in time mentally and try and recreate that contextual experience that they had when they just before and leading up to and when they witnessed the event. The second principle is that memories are stored as a series of interconnected nodes. So you can access a single memory in a number of different ways. So, for example, you can ask a witness to recall the event backwards or from a bird's eye perspective. And sometimes this can trigger additional details. And then there's also social communication techniques. So the cognitive interview is also very much based on developing rapport with a witness, providing or transferring control of the interview to them so they feel like they're controlling the pace, they're relaxed, they feel comfortable enough to report all details and engage in a really exhaustive memory search. And the cognitive interview has been really widely researched and shown to be effective in increasing the amount of correct details that witnesses recall, with either not decreasing their accuracy or even improving their accuracy. So you're getting a higher quantity of information that's just as high or even better in quality than a standard police interview. And this is the case with neurotypical individuals, neurotypical adults, and also in a modified format for children and witnesses with intellectual disability to some extent. So based on the task support hypothesis, we might predict that the cognitive interview could be actually quite beneficial for autistic witnesses as well. But unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be the case. So if we look at the bars on the right, we see this is the non-autistic witnesses. We find the typical effect whereby the cognitive interview increases the volume of correct information that they're recalling compared to a standard structured interview. So this is the same number of retrieval attempts, but without these cognitive interview mnemonics. For the autistic group, there was no significant difference between a structured and a cognitive interview. And this is important because not only does it show that cognitive interview is not being very effective, but also it can be wasting quite valuable police time because it's longer and more time consuming to conduct. However, we also found that the cognitive interview increases the number of incorrect details reported by autistic witnesses. So not only is it in failing to improve the quantity of information they report, it's actually increasing their errors, so making them less accurate overall. So I hope this has illustrated so far that the gold standard police interviewing, very free recall, is not appropriate for autistic witnesses. It fails to support their memory retrieval and often results in less complete and or less accurate recall. And the cognitive interview, which is a very evidence-based, widely used police interviewing technique, is also not effective. So what alternative techniques could be used? Well, some research by Almeida and colleagues with autistic children categorized the different types of questions that were asked of autistic witnesses and coded their responses for how effective these different question types were in eliciting detailed but accurate information. And this ranged from very kind of more open, what they called invitations, but what other people might call free recall. So this is general with no restriction on focus. So tell me what happened. To cued invitations. So this is refocusing attention on previously mentioned details, which then used as contextual cues. So, for example, you mentioned that there were two men exchanging something. Tell me more about that. Then direct, getting more narrow now. So directive questions. So this is requesting additional information or clarification, like when or where did it happen? And then option posing prompts. So this is kind of akin to a recognition test. So closed, ended, yes, no, or forced choice questions. Was the door open or closed? Were the toys on the table when this happened? And they found that cued invitations were the optimal sort of type of questioning or prompt or cue for eliciting the most detailed but accurate information from autistic and indeed non-autistic children. So that it's non-leading, but the parameters of what's being asked are slightly narrowed. So they're refocusing attention on something that they've previously mentioned. In another study with adults, we tested out lots of different types of or methods of questioning. And in particular, we tested one which we called visual verbal prompting, or VVP, and compared this with the use of open questions. So visual verbal prompting involved participants receiving a sort of visual pie diagram with prompts to recall different aspects of the instance. So, for example, compared to the open question, tell me about the last time you went to the bank, a VVP or visual verbal prompting question would be, tell me about the last time you went to the bank, tell me about when it happened, the people who were there, the actions that occurred, the setting, and the objects that were there. Use this card to help you structure your answer. So it's specifying the type of information, and it's providing this kind of visual cue to remind the interviewee that they need to kind of cover all of these things in their response. And we found that this technique was effective in improving the specificity of recall by both autistic and non-autistic adults. And so by specificity, we mean they're providing more episodic information that makes that a specific instance rather than providing general information about the past. So these studies suggest that, in line with the task support hypothesis, providing more prompts or probes is effective in increasing the quantity and the accuracy of information provided by autistic witnesses. However, within a kind of a legal, practical framework, that's not really appropriate to go in at from the outset. So it's not appropriate to go straight in to interviewing a witness with questions. It should be free recall first. And this is the kind of the policy, the protocols for interviewing is that it should be witness driven at the outset. So you can't ask a question about something a witness hasn't already told you about. So there's these legal kind of framework issues. It can also limit completeness because an interviewee will only be answering a question about what you've asked them. They're unlikely to stray into things which are beyond the question parameters, and there might be something that's investigatively relevant that the interviewer doesn't yet know, and therefore the interviewee won't report it unless they're asked about it. And another point to make as well is that while autistic people, at least without intellectual disability, are not more suggestible, and by suggestible we mean they're not more likely, their memory is not more likely to be distorted due to leading or suggestive questioning, there's some evidence that they may be more compliant, so they may be more likely to acquiesce or go along with an interviewer's suggestions for other reasons. We've done some research looking at, sort of to complement the experimental work, police perspectives or their real life experiences on working with autistic people, interviewing autistic people. And in the general pattern of findings for this is that officers that tend to be quite knowledgeable about autism or have some good practice tends to unfortunately be from having their own personal experience of autism, a friend, family member, or someone they know who has autism, as opposed to receiving this information through, or this knowledge and skill through police training. But nevertheless, one officer, for example, or this is a UK detective, describes how he basically narrows the parameters by asking witnesses to tell autistic witnesses to tell him about everything that happened, but from a particular time to a particular time. So rather than tell me everything that happened yesterday, it's narrowed slightly, either within a time period or, for example, what happened at the park yesterday. Again, though, however, this may still limit investigatively relevant detail. There might still be more information that's not within those parameters. It still, to some extent, requires this sort of social cognition and metacognition. So thinking about what is relevant and how accurate you might be for each of these details. And it can still, to some extent, overload these executive functioning and retrieval processing difficulties. So more task support may be needed. So we've recently developed a new technique called the Witness-Aimed First Account Interview, or WAFA. And the aim was to develop an alternative model of interviewing that is compatible within a legally appropriate framework. So that's witness-led from the outset, whilst at the same time supporting the way that autistic people remember and recall events. So first, the witness will generate their own discrete parameter-bound topics from the event. So rather than saying, right, tell me absolutely everything that happened, which is this very kind of bulk free recall, the witness briefly segments it up in just a sentence or a few words. So the interviewer might say, tell me the most important thing that happened. And the witness might say, okay, a man snatched a woman's handbag from a car. And the interviewer will write it down on a Post-it note or something and stick it on the wall, and then say, okay, tell me something else that happened. And the witness might say, a girl came up to the man and asked her if he had any change for parking. And I say, great, thank you. Note it on a Post-it note. Can you tell me something else that happened? And the witness might say, they saw their friend Sarah and gave her a lift into town. That will get noted on the Post-it note, and so forth. And you might end up with 6, 7, it can vary, Post-it notes or segments that basically segments the event or the time period or whatever it is. So this sort of alleviates the need for a witness to suddenly generate everything in one kind of go, which is then followed up by questioning. Instead, they segment the event in these kind of very brief Post-it notes or segments, and then they freely recall each topic in depth within each segment. So the interviewer will say, okay, you said that a man snatched a woman's handbag from a car. Tell me everything you remember about that. And that's where they get the free recall for that segment. And then that can be followed up with further questioning. So it was really designed to support autistic difficulties, for example, in retrieving individual topics or sub-events within the videos, would reduce demands on relational retrieval processes. And then secondly, asking witnesses to recall details within each of the topic boxes that are generated reduces demands on working memory, since participants have available their self-generated event structure that they would otherwise need to hold in mind during recall. And only event details within a single sub-event or topic box are recalled at any one time. And the Post-it notes serve as a visual reminder of the rest of the event structure, which is to then be recalled in separate efforts. And witness-generated segmentation of an event into its component parts is consistent with witness-compatible questioning in that it provides scaffolding for the individual processing styles of autistic witnesses. And then finally, WAFA may also reduce implicit task demands, alleviating the need to infer what and how much to recall, as is often the case during an unbound, unstructured free recall attempt of an entire event. So WAFA increases the number of correct details reported, interestingly, by both autistic and non-autistic witnesses compared to a standard structured interview. There's still a main effective group. So autistic witnesses still recall slightly less than non-autistic witnesses, but it does improve their recall relative to a structured standard control interview. So both autistic and non-autistic participants verbalized around 15% more correct information under WAFA. Also, WAFA improves accuracy. So both groups, autistic and non-autistic witnesses, were more accurate in a WAFA compared to a control interview. So some other techniques as well. So interviewing should be seen, or techniques should be seen as a kind of toolkit that interviewers can use, so they can, pull whatever out that is needed for that witness, for that type of event, for that situation. So in some situations, it might be WAFA. In another situation, it might be something else, or it could be in combination. So sketching is another technique that's been shown to increase the accuracy of information reported by autistic adolescents. So sketching can be quite useful in reducing cognitive and social factors. So it's supporting a kind of more visual processing style. And it really reduces the pressure of the interviewer and the interviewee interaction. And it can be done in different ways. It can be done either as a sort of sketching to reinstate the context, where the interviewee is instructed to sketch in order to help them remember the event, or it can be done as to sketch the event and tell what happens as they're sketching. So they're sort of very similar, but sort of subtly distinct techniques. Both seem to be effective for autistic witnesses. And it can be quite a simple tool to apply during interviews. Another option, which needs further examination, is to use more remote forms of interviewing to alleviate the social cognitive burden. So it's not all about accuracy or informativeness. As I mentioned in relation to metacognition, there's this trade-off. So you're required to monitor details for their accuracy, but also you want to report the finest grain of information. So rather than just saying the guy's hat was red, you might want to say, well, it was a kind of light red and it had this pattern on it. And it's this kind of assessment process of how accurate you are for details, whilst also trying to be informative about it. So we looked at this across 3 phases of questioning with autistic and non-autistic witnesses, varying the instructions that were given. So witnesses were either told to maximise accuracy or to maximise informativeness. And then the conditions in which questions were delivered. So they were either delivered socially in a face-to-face interviewer situation or online. And we found that both autistic and non-autistic participants showed a tendency to prioritise informativeness at the expense of accuracy. So they were more likely to provide more fine-grained answers. That's a sort of natural tendency. Both groups' accuracy was improved with the instruction to maximise accuracy over informativeness. So again, this is quite important because there might be certain investigative situations where accuracy is more important than informativeness, and vice versa, depending on, for example, if there are other witnesses that can corroborate the information. Overall accuracy also improved, interestingly, when questions were delivered socially for both groups. But that's in relation to overall accuracy. We found a kind of quite subtle difference. So when the autistic group showed poorer reporting control, so this is making these trade-off decisions between accuracy and informativeness when the questions were asked socially, but the difference between groups dissipated when the task was delivered online. So this is quite provisional. We need more research into this, but potentially having a non-social or even possibly a quasi-social format might be quite fruitful for autistic witnesses. And this is certainly something that should be explored with the individual interviewee or those that know them well. So an important point to make here is that all witnesses and all autistic witnesses are different. And so what works for one autistic witness won't work for another autistic witness. And it's important to consult the individual and those that know them or professionals in order to help make the environment and the techniques the best fit as possible for them. And just to note more broadly about the environment as well. So I mentioned that autism is associated with sensory difficulties, and there may be some situations that might be particularly unbearable for some witnesses. And that should be explored so that you can modify the environment appropriately. And that might be interviewing in the person's own home, or having a particular time when it's done, or allowing them a particular object in the room with them. So that's all been really about witness interviews. Suspect interviews are likely to be even more demanding. In the UK, we have more of an investigation model. So it's very much about fact finding, and it's less about interrogation, or it's not about interrogation. In the US, there is still a kind of interrogation culture. Not completely pervasive, but some forces are more investigatively focused, or some interviewing officers are more investigatively focused, whereas some still adopt the interrogation model, which is obviously going to be really problematic, particularly for an autistic person. But even within an investigative framework, there are still techniques that are designed to detect deception that might be particularly difficult for an autistic person. So these are developed based on the notion that deception is more cognitively demanding than truth-telling. So if you increase the cognitive load, you're more likely to elicit cues to deception. So this might be things like asking the witness unexpected questions. So if they said their alibi is they were in a restaurant, asking them to describe where they were sat in relation to the person they were with and the other diners, or to recall the event from a bird's eye perspective, or to recall it backwards. And we know that these are things that can be quite difficult for an autistic person due to difficulties in memory retrieval, narratives, executive function, and so forth. Another issue with suspect interviews as well is that they're quite often used to make veracity assessments, whether someone's telling the truth or not. And there can be differences in the way that autistic people present that may make the veracity assessments less accurate ultimately. For example, making atypical or no eye contact at all, or having repetitive movements may be wrongly relied upon to assess that that person is not being truthful. So there's an urgent need for some research in this area. At present, we're lacking it, although Ralph Bagnall is currently doing a PhD in this area. So there should be some research out soon. So watch this space on that. In the UK, at least, we do have some avenues for support in an interview. So an interviewing officer, depending on their level, but they're not really expected to know everything about autism, but there are professionals that are really knowledgeable that can help. So in the UK, we have the Witness Intermediary Scheme. So autistic people are categorised as vulnerable in relation to them being eligible for an intermediary, a registered intermediary. And a registered intermediary is normally a professional like a speech and language therapist, although they can have other roles as their regular job, but they're normally a witness intermediary, registered intermediary, as a kind of secondary role. And they will carry out an assessment of the witness and assess what is the best technique for it, or the best way to interview them. And this will also involve thinking about environmental modifications as well as the actual questioning techniques. And they will assist in an interview to support communication between the interviewer and the interviewee. Unfortunately for suspects, we don't have quite the same provision at this stage, although suspects can be eligible for a non-registered intermediary, which is ultimately the same as a registered intermediary. In fact, quite often you get registered intermediaries that are also non-registered intermediaries, but for the purposes of suspects, they're termed non-registered intermediaries. But more likely is that they will receive an appropriate adult. And we need more research on both intermediaries and appropriate adults. But appropriate adults tend to not have quite the same level of training in relation to supporting communication techniques that an intermediary will have. They're more there to make sure the person understands their rights and are treated fairly. But they're both very important schemes, and anecdotally and evidence from other areas suggests that they are really useful, but we do need more empirical evidence to support their use. So the key take-home points are to really adopt a flexible interviewing style. So one size does not fit all. So rethinking traditional models like free recall and the cognitive interview, to think about techniques such as WOFA or sketching, or the use of non-leading but direct and focused questions that narrow the parameters. Requesting support, be it a registered intermediary for witnesses, non-registered intermediary for suspects, or appropriate adults for suspects, at least in the UK. And making environmental adjustments as well. So thinking about where the witness is being interviewed, where else could they be interviewed that would make them feel more comfortable, and therefore they'd be able to provide better evidence, or making adjustments to the current interviewing room. And there's some resources available for reading more about interviewing and best practice and guidance for questioning autistic individuals. Thank you for listening.